Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela's Social Studies for segment 2 of the Roaring Twenties. So now we're going to be talking about people of the Roaring Twenties. Whatever happened to the immigrants? So if you remember from class that the United States experienced 3 major rounds of immigration. Of course, the British was the first, then the Irish and Germans between 1840 and 1860, and the Italians, Greeks, and Chinese between 1880 and 1914. It was the start of World War I that almost stopped immigration into the United States completely. Now that the war was over, what was America going to do about the immigration issue? Stop it. That's what. Like every major wave of immigration, Americans had concerns about the newly arrived, and xenophobia, which is the fear of foreigners, ran rampant, so Americans attempted to restrict it. Many of the new arrivals entered the country with no money and could not speak any English, and like always, laborers felt that the new immigrants were going to take their jobs for less pay. They also feared that these new immigrants would infiltrate and change the American culture, so much so that the government needed to step in. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, which limited the total number of immigrants allowed into the country, allowing the majority of immigrants from Western Europe only to come to America. 3 years later, in 1924, Congress passed the National Origins Act, which banned immigration from East Asia entirely, just like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and reduced the number of immigrants allowed to enter the country to only 350,000 per year. The combination of these two acts led to a drastic drop in immigration to the United States. Americans were becoming fearful of immigrants, and it began to show. So all of this post-war tension and xenophobia compiled into one famous court case in the 1920s, the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants and anarchists, or people who are anti-governmental or favoring no government. America's fear and distrust of immigrants led to a belief that all immigrants were dangerous. On April 15, 1920, a payroll clerk and a security guard were shot to death and robbed of $15,000. Eyewitnesses said that they saw 2 men commit the crime and get into a getaway vehicle with 2 or 3 others. After several weeks, only Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested. There were no other arrests, and money was never linked to them or recovered. Now, when they were arrested, they were armed, but there was very little evidence for conviction. Sacco and Vanzetti swore that they were innocent until their last breath. The prosecution focused on their anarchist past and the fact that they were Italian immigrants, and that's all the jury needed to hear. In 1921, they were convicted, later to be executed in 1927. Riots and protests sprung up in Italy while some Americans celebrated. The view on immigrants was steadfast. They were dangerous. Now, near the beginning of World War I in 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian monarchy and took over the government, putting in place their favored form of government, communism. After the war, Americans feared that the communists would attempt to gain power in the United States, and that led to another fear and scare of another group of immigrants or governmental ideas as a whole. The Communist Labor Party was formed by radicals in 1919 and was blamed for many of the 3,000 labor strikes after the war. In the spring of 1919, nearly 40 mail bombs were sent in the mail to many senators, attorney generals, and famous people like John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. Some of the bombs detonated and some of the bombs didn't, but all of the bombs were blamed on anarchists and communists, even though there was very little evidence to support the claim. The bombings across the United States led to a fear of Italian anarchists and Russian communists, otherwise known as Reds, and led to a period of time called the Red Scare. In response to the bombings, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer organized a series of raids nationwide between the end of 1919 and the start of 1920, now called Red Summer. The raids, called Palmer Raids, broke up communist and radical groups across the nation, using physical violence, arresting thousands, and deporting hundreds back to Russia. So what about minority groups in the United States and their rights? After the war, minority groups began to organize to demand civil rights. Remember that during the war, a majority of young white laborers were sent off to war, leading to a large migration of Mexican and African Americans from the South to the North. In 1929, Latin Americans formed the League of United Latin American Citizens, which would protest segregation and voting restrictions. Native Americans fought for their rights as well. In 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizens Act, which granted citizenship to all Native Americans and later prevented the federal government from taking back reservation lands. One of the largest groups of people to move from the South to the North are African Americans. I mentioned that this was called the Great Migration, and it lasted decades. Huge numbers of African Americans left the South to take jobs in northern factories during the war, lasting through the 1920s. In 1919, with many white laborers fearing that white Americans would be in lasting competition with African Americans, race riots broke out in Chicago, which left 500 injured and 39 dead. Prior to the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was on the decline, but northern white labor riots and southern white aggression, the KKK, made a resurgence in the South. The Klan harassed African Americans, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. They would physically abuse, injure, and even kill people who they did not like. The Klan worked against urbanization, women's rights, and modern technology. Membership ballooned to over 5 million members, consisting of many members who belonged to local and state police forces and government officials. The Klan became very influential in Southern politics. Fighting the war against the Klan, African Americans began to fight and protect their rights. One of the strongest proponents for African American rights was Marcus Garvey. He was a leader among black citizens across the United States. He formed the United Negro Improvement Association to promote economic cooperation among black businesses. He encouraged black people to express pride in their culture and establish economic independence. Garvey would dress in military garb, even though he was not in the armed forces, and after witnessing the wrongs against African Americans, Garvey decided that equality could never be attained in America. As the NAACP placed advertisements in newspapers across the nation, Garvey created the Back to Africa movement. He made black people proud of their race, and in his new black nationalism movement took root. The Back to Africa movement was a plan to bring black Americans back to the motherland, and a strong revival of black culture would flourish. After he gained nearly 80,000 followers, Garvey founded the Black Star Steamship Company to begin transporting African Americans back to Africa. Sadly, the government kept a close eye on the Crusader, and he was convicted of mail fraud and was deported to Jamaica. All right, guys, we'll see you next time on the third segment of the Roaring Twenties.